The data emerging from recent psychological assessments of large-scale educational interventions reveals a peculiar and deeply troubling trend in the modern West. When we perform a rigorous analysis of the effects of structured goal-setting programs, such as the Future Authoring Project, we observe a significant differential impact across demographics. Specifically, these programs seem to provide a disproportionately robust benefit to young men who have been traditionally excluded or marginalized within the modern academic framework. These are the individuals who did not excel in the increasingly rigid and standardized environment of high school. They are often the ones who failed to select a career path with a clear professional destination or a sense of tangible progression. In many cases, they exist in a state of chronic demotivation, characterized by an ambiguous and often resentful relationship with the very idea of formal institutional education. The fundamental question that we must address as a society is why these structured interventions work so effectively for men, while women appear to be thriving regardless of them. Part of the answer lies in the current state of our institutional structures, which seem to be increasingly aligned with specific female temperamental traits. At this particular moment in human history, women are significantly outperforming men at almost every level of the educational and professional hierarchy. One primary psychological driver for this widespread success is the personality trait of agreeableness, which is one of the 5 major dimensions of human character. Agreeable individuals are generally characterized as being compassionate, cooperative, and fundamentally willing to follow established rules to maintain social harmony. If a social or educational system sets out a specific structure and defines a clear pathway to attainment, agreeable people will not rebel against that structure. They will simply go along with the requirements, fulfill the assignments as dictated, and move steadily toward the predefined goal. This temperament is working exceptionally well for women in the current cultural climate, as they tend to score consistently higher on the agreeableness scale than men. However, when we examine the other end of the personality distribution, the disagreeable end, we find a population that is overwhelmingly male. In any normal distribution of personality across a population, there is a massive overlap between the sexes in the middle of the curve. But the radical and most consequential differences occur at the absolute extremes of that distribution. The most agreeable people in the world are almost all women, while the most disagreeable and challenging people in the world are almost all men. Disagreeable men simply will not do anything they do not want to do, especially if they do not see the point of the activity. If they perceive a system as being stupid, biased, or intellectually useless, their natural psychological response is to say no and withdraw entirely from the process. Instead of conforming to a school system that they find pathologically restrictive or irrelevant, they go home to play video games or pursue isolated interests. They are not motivated by social praise or the simple desire to please authority figures, which makes them very difficult to manage within traditional institutions. In a video game environment, they find a meritocracy where effort leads to immediate results, and competence is the only currency that matters. But a fascinating phenomenon occurs when you take these same disaffected men and ask them to define their own autonomous vision for the future. When you force them to sit down and articulate what they actually want, and then ask them to build a tactical plan to get it, they suddenly find a reason to exert effort. They need to see a direct, unbreakable connection between their daily labor and a goal that they have personally validated as being worth having. Without that deep personal connection to a higher purpose, they simply wither away into a state of nihilistic distraction and quiet desperation. There is another strange and compelling piece of evidence that suggests a deep hunger for this kind of direct, demanding communication among men. On digital platforms like YouTube, the vast majority of people consuming deep psychological and philosophical content are young men. In my own personal experience, over 90% of the audience for these long-form lectures consists of men. This occurs despite the fact that 80% of formal psychology students in universities are women. This is a radical and undeniable inversion of what you would expect to see if the interest was purely academic or professional in nature. It suggests that there is a massive, underserved population of men searching for a type of guidance that they are not receiving from traditional media. When I speak to these crowds in person, I see the same pattern repeated in cities and venues all over the Western world. The rooms are filled with thousands of young men who are not looking for more rights or more social validation from the state. They are looking for a serious discussion about the one thing that our culture has almost stopped talking about entirely, which is personal responsibility. For the last several decades, our public discourse has focused almost exclusively on the expansion and protection of individual rights. While rights are certainly important for a free society, you cannot have a coherent or sustainable conversation about rights without the corresponding conversation about responsibility. Your rights are technically my responsibility to uphold, and my rights are your responsibility to respect. If we only talk about what we are owed as individuals, we are only having half of the necessary discussion about the nature of human existence. When you leave out the half that deals with responsibility, you are inadvertently leaving out the primary source of meaning in human life. Life is inherently difficult, characterized by inevitable suffering, physical limitation, and eventual mortality. If you are suffering through a difficult and often tragic existence, you need something powerful to make that suffering worthwhile. Rights do not give your life meaning, as they only provide you with a set of permissions and legal protections. True meaning is found exclusively in the adoption of a heavy load that serves a purpose beyond the self. It is found in the conscious decision to pick something up and carry it, even when the weight is enough to make you stumble. There is an ancient and profound archetypal story about the fall of man that highlights our inherent vulnerability and our tendency towards self-contempt. We are useless, easily hurt, and easily killed, and at a deep level, we are all painfully aware of this reality. In the face of that inherent weakness and mortality, why should anyone have any genuine self-respect at all? The answer is that self-respect is not a gift. It is earned by demonstrating to yourself that you are capable of moving something from point A to point B. It is the act of proving that, despite your many flaws and inadequacies, you can be of practical use to your family and your community. When I talk to large crowds of men about this, their eyes light up in a way that is both heartening and deeply tragic to witness. It is heartening because it shows that the spirit of competence and the desire to build is still alive within them. But it is tragic because it suggests that no one in their lives has ever told them this fundamental truth before. Young men today are so hungry for the idea of being useful that they are actually thrilled by the prospect of genuine hard work. They have been told for years by the prevailing culture that their natural ambitions are pathological and that their presence in the world is inherently oppressive. If you tell a boy from a young age that his desire to compete, build, and succeed is fundamentally evil, he will eventually stop trying altogether. But the consequence of that withdrawal is not a more peaceful or harmonious society. It is a generation of men full of self-contempt and nihilism. A man who has nothing worth living for will eventually turn to impulsive, low-class pleasure as a way to numb the pain of his own uselessness. This is the central lesson of the story of Pinocchio's Pleasure Island, where boys who refuse to grow up eventually turn into donkeys. They become beasts of burden for the amusement of others because they refuse to become masters of their own destiny through responsibility. We see this psychological drama playing out in the real world through the devastating opiate epidemic and the rising rates of suicide among men. When a man loses his job, his status, or his sense of purpose, he doesn't just lose his source of income. He loses his psychological integrity and his reason to respect the man he sees in the mirror every morning. He begins to despise himself, and that internal self-contempt often manifests as chronic physical and emotional pain that demands medication. We are essentially pack animals at a biological level, and like a sled dog that has no sled to pull, we will eventually tear ourselves apart. A sled dog is never happier or more biologically fulfilled than when it is leaning into the harness, pulling a heavy weight across the ice. Men are built with a similar psychological architecture, in that they need to pull against a weight to feel that their existence is justified. This is why the message of radical responsibility is the ultimate and most necessary counterculture of our time. In a world that constantly screams for more indulgence, more safety, and less accountability, the most radical thing a man can do is grow up. This process begins with the identification of a highest value, what we might call a star to navigate by in the dark. You have to decide what you are aiming for with your life. And while you have some choice in the matter, there are fixed biological and social criteria. Your goal should be something that is good for you today, but also good for you next week, next month, and 10 years from now. It should be something that facilitates your personal growth while simultaneously providing tangible value to the people you love. When you pick a load that meets these criteria, the weight of that responsibility becomes the very thing that stabilizes your soul. It gives you a justified reason to get out of bed in the morning, even when the world feels dark, cold, and unforgiving. The modern world has done an excellent job of protecting people's legal rights, but it has done a terrible job of offering them a mission worth dying for. We have forgotten that the human spirit is built for the struggle of the climb, not for the safety of the base camp. If you remove the struggle from a man's life, you don't create a utopia. You create a vacuum that is quickly filled by resentment and despair. The young men coming out to listen to these lectures are not there because they want to be entertained or validated in their victimhood. They are there because they are starving for a challenge that demands the absolute best of their character and their strength. They have had enough of the shallow rhetoric of modern sensitivity and the empty promises of participation trophies that mean nothing. They want to know how to be strong, how to be reliable, and how to be the kind of man who can be counted on when a real crisis hits. Every public appearance I make confirms this deep-seated and universal need for a return to the heroic path of the individual. It is a path that requires the voluntary adoption of the heaviest load you can possibly carry without breaking. By doing so, you transform your own inevitable suffering into a meaningful sacrifice for the sake of something better. You stop being a victim of your historical circumstances and start being the architect of a future that is worth inhabiting. The message itself is simple, though the execution of that message is the difficult work of an entire lifetime. Pick up your load, straighten your shoulders, and walk with purpose toward the highest light you can perceive. The meaning of your life depends entirely on your willingness to do exactly that, regardless of how difficult it becomes. It is the only way to tolerate your own existence in the face of your mortality and your many inadequacies, and it is the only way to build a civilization that is worth living in for our children and those who will follow us. This is not an easy path, and it was never meant to be easy, but it is the only path that leads to genuine human fulfillment. The alternative is a slow, agonizing descent into a meaningless existence, fueled by bitterness, resentment, and eventual self-destruction. Choose responsibility today, choose meaning over convenience, and watch as your internal and external worlds begin to transform. There's nothing more powerful or more terrifyingly effective than a man who has finally decided to be useful to the world. And there's absolutely nothing our world needs more right now than a generation of men who have made that difficult choice. Success in the modern world is not about avoiding the weight. It is about becoming strong enough to carry it with honor. Take the first step today by identifying the smallest thing you could do to make your life better, and then have the courage to do it. From that small seat of responsibility, a forest of meaning will eventually grow to shelter you and everyone you care about. The time for excuses is over, and the time for the adoption of your true mission has finally arrived. You have the capacity to be the person that others can lean on when the storm arrives. Do not trade your potential for the cheap comforts of a safe and meaningless life. The world is waiting for you to stand up, to take your place, and to lead with the strength that comes from bearing a heavy load. Embrace the challenge, find your purpose, and never look back.